1935, Alabama, the macabre ritual of rural cults and the family who impregnated the dead. Deep in the shadowed hills of northern Alabama, where the ancient Appalachian wilderness seemed to push back against civilization, lay a valley time itself had willingly bypassed. The year was 1935. The family who impregnated the dead, the most macabre ritual of rural cults. While the rest of America struggled through the Great Depression, the Blackwood family had forged their own isolated existence, untouched by the outside world for nearly 7 decades. Our story starts on a crisp autumn morning. County Health Inspector Thomas Mitchell ventured into the area locals knew as Blackwood Hollow. Reports of concerning conditions and unusual illnesses had finally reached Montgomery, prompting this rare intrusion into a community that had deliberately cut itself off from society even before the Civil War. The road disappeared about 3 miles back, Mitchell would later write in his official report. I followed what seemed to be a footpath until the first structures appeared, crude cabins, lacking running water or electricity, despite the recent efforts of the Tennessee Valley Authority in neighboring counties. What Mitchell uncovered that day would eventually be documented as one of the most disturbing cases of generational consanguinity in American history. The Blackwood family, comprising roughly 64 individuals across 4 generations, had maintained a fully closed genetic lineage since 1868. That year, Confederate veteran Isaiah Blackwood had led his extended family into the hills to escape Reconstruction. The physical consequences were immediately clear. Mitchell noted that nearly half the community exhibited distinctive facial anomalies, pronounced brow ridges, severely recessed chins, and eyes that were unusually close-set. Many adults barely reached 5 feet tall, with disproportionately short limbs. Yet, these visible traits were merely surface signs of a much deeper genetic catastrophe. Mitchell's notes recorded children as old as 12 unable to form coherent sentences, with the cognitive development of toddlers. He also observed 3 separate cases of individuals born with extra digits that had been crudely removed. What truly set the Blackwood case apart from other documented instances of isolated communities was the development of their ritualistic practices surrounding reproduction. Through careful interviews with the more communicative family members, Mitchell slowly began to reveal a system so aberrant that his superiors initially dismissed his reports as fantasy. The Blackwoods had developed their own insular belief system, a strange mix of folk superstitions, distorted Christianity, and practices designed to rationalize their increasingly limited mating pool. The community followed the leadership of Elijah Blackwood, Isaiah's grandson, and the family patriarch, who enforced a strict hierarchy and controlled every aspect of family life. At the core of this belief system was a practice they called the returning, which would eventually give the case its infamous name. When a young woman passed away before bearing children, the Blackwoods did not consider her reproductive capacity ended. In a ritual shrouded in secrecy, certain male family members were designated to reunite with recently deceased female relatives before burial. They believed this would allow the deceased spirit to return through future offspring. Combined with systematic arranged unions between first cousins, siblings, and occasionally even parent and child, this practice had created a closed genetic pool with catastrophic results. Medical examinations would later show that 83% of children born in the community after 1920 suffered from various genetic disorders, with many proving fatal in early childhood. The discovery of the Blackwood community would ultimately lead to one of Alabama's most complex legal and ethical challenges of that era, forcing authorities to confront difficult questions about the limits of religious freedom, the state's responsibility toward isolated citizens, and how to balance individual autonomy with protection from harm. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss our exclusive investigations into America's darkest family secrets that mainstream media refuses to cover. Hit subscribe now to join our community of truth seekers. The Patriarch's Authority and the Book of Returns. Elijah Blackwood was 67 years old in 1935, although his clouded eyes and hunched posture suggested someone much older. As the health department investigation intensified, officials learned that Elijah had established an intricate system of rules governing every aspect of family life, particularly reproduction. County records indicated that Isaiah Blackwood had originally fled to the hills with his wife, 3 brothers, their spouses, and a total of 11 children. This relatively small founding population had expanded to over 60 individuals within 3 generations, but with virtually no introduction of genetic diversity. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, one of the few female physicians working with Alabama's Department of Public Health at the time, explained that the Patriarch's authority was absolute. Family members described a complex hierarchy where Elijah determined who would be paired, when, and under what circumstances. The Blackwood family operated under a distorted interpretation of biblical passages, selectively citing Old Testament examples of familial marriages while developing elaborate justifications for their practices. Elijah maintained his authority through a combination of religious fear, the family's genuine belief that the outside world was spiritually contaminated, and isolation. The most disturbing discovery was the family's Book of Returns, a handwritten ledger documenting unions between the living and the deceased. This practice, which seemingly started in the 1890s, was surrounded by elaborate ceremony. The deceased young women, typically those who had died from complications of childbirth, a tragically common occurrence in the community, were prepared by the family's eldest women. The ritual was supposedly intended to preserve the spirit line and ensure the deceased's essence remained within the family bloodline. The genetic consequences of such practices across multiple generations resulted in a cascade of increasingly severe health conditions, Dr. Whitfield documented. We observed unusually high rates of immune deficiencies, heart defects, and neurological abnormalities, she noted. Of particular concern were the cognitive impairments present in approximately 70% of children under 16. Isolation and genetic collapse. The physical isolation of Blackwood Hollow had been reinforced by deliberate efforts to remain hidden. On the few occasions that outsiders had stumbled upon the community in previous decades, they were either threatened or misled about the nature of the family relationships. When Blackwood men ventured into nearby towns for essential supplies, a rare occurrence, they revealed nothing about their home life and spoke little. One former shopkeeper from the nearest town, some 12 miles away, recalled, "They'd come maybe twice a year, always the same 3 or 4 men, paid in old coins, sometimes Confederate notes that hadn't been valid for decades. Wouldn't talk except to ask for what they needed. Always seemed jumpy, like they expected trouble." This isolation had another devastating consequence: without access to medical care, preventable conditions often became fatal. Women frequently died in childbirth, and children with treatable conditions perished from complications. Those with severe congenital abnormalities, which became increasingly common with each generation, rarely survived to adulthood. Perhaps most tragically, the community appeared unaware that their suffering was self-inflicted. They had developed elaborate supernatural explanations for the increasing health problems, believing them to be spiritual tests rather than the inevitable result of genetic collapse. They had no concept of genetics, Mitchell noted. When I attempted to explain why their children were suffering, they became hostile. Elijah accused me of bringing outside sickness into their community with my words. As investigators pieced together the family structure, they discovered that by the 1930s, every Blackwood was related to every other through multiple familial pathways. The average coefficient of relationship within the community was estimated to be higher than any previously documented case in medical literature, exceeding even the infamous Spanish Habsburg dynasty that collapsed under the weight of its own consanguinity. The situation raised profound questions. How should the state respond to such extreme isolation when it resulted in demonstrable harm? What rights did these children have to protection, education, and medical care? And how had such practices continued undetected for so long in a state increasingly connected by modern infrastructure and government services? These questions would soon be answered as authorities prepared for an intervention that would permanently alter the fate of the Blackwood family and expose their hidden world to the harsh light of public scrutiny. Intervention and legal battleground. By late autumn of 1935, state authorities had gathered sufficient evidence to justify intervention in Blackwood Hollow. What they could not anticipate was the resistance they would encounter, not just from the family itself, but from a system unprepared to address such an extreme case. "We expected to find poverty and isolation," Sheriff James Donovan recalled. "What we found was something from another century entirely." The November 14th intervention began with a convoy of vehicles carrying health officials, law enforcement, and social workers navigating the crude paths into Blackwood Hollow. Their arrival immediately triggered panic among the community members, many of whom fled into the surrounding forest. Elijah Blackwood stood his ground on the porch of the main family cabin, a shotgun across his lap. Beside him sat his sister wife Martha, herself visibly affected by generations of consanguinity, with her misaligned eyes and characteristically small jaw. Their confrontation with authorities would later be described as a collision between two utterly different Americas. "This is Blackwood land," Elijah reportedly declared. "God gave us this place to keep our blood pure from the wickedness outside. You have no authority here." The children's physical condition ultimately forced the officials' hands. Among the 57 family members present that day, 17 were under 12 years old. Medical personnel on site identified 12 children requiring immediate medical attention, including twin 5-year-old girls with severe hydrocephalus and a 9-year-old boy with an untreated bone infection. The community's living conditions shocked even experienced social workers. The cabins lacked basic sanitation, and many children showed signs of malnutrition. A crude family cemetery contained 47 graves, most unmarked save for small stone cairns, many sized for young children and infants. Most disturbing was the discovery of a separate burial area reserved for what the family called the returning ones. These graves, exclusively female, were maintained with unusual care and marked with distinctive symbols. It was here that investigators found physical evidence supporting the accounts of post-mortem rituals, specific preparations of the graves that aligned with the descriptions found in the family's Book of Returns. I need to pause this story for a moment. If you're feeling the same sense of disbelief and sorrow that I am while recounting this tragic history, type "This bloodline should have ended" in the comments. Your words acknowledge the suffering these innocent children endured and help us remember the importance of protecting the vulnerable from such harmful practices. Legal precedents and genetic catastrophe. The children's removal from Blackwood Hollow marked the case's transition from a public health emergency to a legal battleground. Elijah and 7 other adult male family members were taken into custody, while the remaining adults and children were transported to facilities in Montgomery for medical evaluation and care. Medical examinations revealed the full extent of the genetic catastrophe. Dr. Raymond Phillips, who led the pediatric assessments, documented his findings. The prevalence of recessive genetic disorders is unlike anything in modern medical literature. We've identified cases of Tay-Sachs disease, phenylketonuria, and multiple rare metabolic disorders. All conditions, he noted, that become exponentially more common with sustained consanguinity. The adult Blackwoods exhibited their own constellation of health issues. Hearing impairments affected nearly 60% of adults over 30. Early-onset dementia-like symptoms appeared common among those in their 40s. Fertility had declined precipitously in the youngest adult generation, nature's own defense against the genetic collapse. The legal proceedings that followed set important precedents for state intervention in isolated religious communities. Prosecutors faced the challenge of applying modern laws to practices that seemed to belong to a different era entirely. The defense argued that the Blackwoods' religious beliefs and isolation should protect them from outside interference. Judge William Thornton, who presided over the case, wrote in his decision, "While this court respects religious freedom as fundamental to our nation, no belief system, however sincerely held, grants license to inflict demonstrable harm upon children." The evidence of physical and developmental injuries resulting directly from the systematic consanguinity practiced by the defendants is overwhelming and cannot be protected under claims of religious liberty. Elijah Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years for multiple charges, including abuse of a corpse, the legal term applied to the post-mortem practices, and child endangerment. Other adult male family members received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The women and children faced a different challenge: integration into a society they had been taught to fear. The younger children, placed with foster families, showed remarkable adaptability despite their developmental delays. However, many of the older family members struggled with the transition, their entire worldview shattered by exposure to modern America in the midst of the Great Depression. As 1936 began, the Blackwood case began to fade from headlines, but its implications for public health policy, legal precedent, and our understanding of genetic inheritance would continue to resonate through medical and legal literature for decades to come. Healing and legacy. The spring of 1936 brought new challenges as the state grappled with the aftermath of the Blackwood case. While the legal proceedings had concluded, the more complex work of addressing the family's social and medical needs was just beginning. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, whose documentation had been crucial, continued working with the Blackwood children. Her pioneering approach, combining medical intervention with careful psychological support, would later influence protocols for helping individuals from isolated communities. "These children exist in a unique medical category," Dr. Whitfield wrote. "Their physical conditions result directly from generational consanguinity, but their social and psychological challenges stem from indoctrination and isolation. Both aspects require simultaneous treatment." The youngest Blackwood children adapted most successfully. 5-year-old Sarah, despite mild cognitive delays and a cleft palate, thrived in her foster home. By summer, she was showing curiosity about the world beyond Blackwood Hollow and speaking in complete sentences for the first time. The teenagers and young adults faced more significant hurdles. Most held deeply ingrained fears about the outside world, based on Elijah's teachings. Many had never learned to write or read. Several young women, themselves products of consanguineous unions, were already mothers to children with severe congenital conditions. The challenge, explained social worker Ruth Henderson, was helping them understand that their suffering wasn't divine punishment, but the predictable result of closed genetic inheritance. This required compassion rather than judgment. Medical researchers from Johns Hopkins University, having learned of the case, traveled to Alabama to study the Blackwood family. Their examinations confirmed the state health department's findings. The family exhibited one of the highest concentrations of recessive genetic disorders ever documented in a single population. In one family line descending directly from Isaiah's oldest son, we identified 6 distinct recessive conditions, noted Dr. James Harrington in his 1938 research paper. This represents a genetic collapse that typically takes many more generations to manifest. The intensification of consanguinity through the family's ritual practices dramatically accelerated this process. The Blackwood case ultimately contributed significantly to the growing field of genetic counseling. The detailed family trees constructed by researchers provided clear evidence of inheritance patterns that would later be confirmed through advances in genetic science. For the adult Blackwood women, integration into society came with difficult revelations. Martha Blackwood, Elijah's sister wife, reportedly broke down in tears upon learning about basic genetic principles, saying, "All those babies we buried, we thought it was God's will, but we were causing it ourselves." The most challenging aspect of the case involved explaining to the Blackwood women the true nature of the returning ritual. Many had participated in preparing female relatives' bodies without fully understanding the violations that followed. Their complex emotions, betrayal, grief, anger, required specialized psychological support rarely available in 1930s America. Reverend Michael Collins, a Methodist minister who worked with several Blackwood women, noted their spiritual crisis. They're confronting the realization that practices presented to them as sacred were harmful both physically and spiritually. Their journey toward healing requires not just medical care, but a complete rebuilding of their worldview. By late 1936, the Blackwood children had been placed in 17 different foster homes across Alabama. State officials made the controversial decision to separate siblings, hoping to break the cycle of familial interdependence and prevent any continuation of consanguineous relationships as they matured. The older generation's story was often tragic. Several elderly Blackwoods, unable to adapt to life outside their isolated community, passed away within months of the intervention. Others developed severe depression as they grappled with the revelation that their lifestyle had caused immeasurable suffering to their descendants. Lasting impact. The genetic legacy of the Blackwood family would continue for generations. Even with consanguinity ended, the recessive genes had become fixed in many family lines. Children born to Blackwood women who later married outside the community still showed higher rates of genetic disorders, though less severe than previous generations. This case established important precedents that would influence how authorities approached isolated communities in the future. It demonstrated that religious freedom, while constitutionally protected, had limits when practices directly harmed children. It also highlighted the responsibility of public health systems to identify and intervene in isolated populations experiencing preventable suffering. As autumn returned to Alabama in 1936, Blackwood Hollow stood empty, its cabins slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The family cemetery remained, a somber reminder of generations of preventable loss and suffering. Nearly 90 years have passed since authorities first entered Blackwood Hollow. Yet, the case continues to resonate through legal precedent, medical literature, and the lives of the survivors' descendants. The most comprehensive follow-up study, conducted in 1965 by the University of Alabama's Department of Medical Genetics, traced 122 direct descendants of the original Blackwood family. Their findings revealed both the persistent effects of genetic damage and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Dr. Margaret Williams, the lead researcher, noted that the third generation of Blackwood descendants, grandchildren of those removed in 1935, showed significantly reduced incidence of genetic disorders. However, certain conditions, particularly recessive traits carried by multiple family lines, continue to appear at higher rates than in the general population. Sarah Blackwood Johnson, the 5-year-old girl who had adapted so well to her foster home, became one of the case's most remarkable success stories. Despite her early health challenges, she graduated high school, married, and became a nurse. Her understanding of her family's history inspired her to work specifically with children born with genetic disorders. My patients' parents often feel guilt or shame, Sarah explained in a rare 1978 interview. I tell them that these conditions aren't punishment or failure. They're medical realities we can address with compassion and science. That's the lesson I took from my family's tragedy. Not all outcomes were so positive. Records indicate that at least 14 of the Blackwood children removed in 1935 to 36 experienced significant struggles throughout their lives. Several never fully overcame their developmental delays. A few, particularly those who had been adolescents during the intervention, eventually returned to isolated rural living, though none attempted to resurrect the consanguineous practices of their childhood. The Blackwood case had lasting impacts on Alabama public health policy. The state established one of the nation's first rural health monitoring programs in 1937, specifically designed to identify isolated communities at risk. This program, revolutionary for its time, recognized that cultural and geographic isolation could create public health emergencies requiring proactive intervention. Legal scholars continue to cite Judge Thornton's ruling as an important precedent in cases involving religious practices that potentially harm children. His careful balancing of child welfare protection with religious liberty established principles still referenced in contemporary cases involving isolated religious communities and medical care refusal. The medical documentation from the case found renewed relevance in the early days of genetic science. When researchers began mapping the human genome decades later, the detailed Blackwood family records provided valuable historical evidence of inheritance patterns for numerous rare conditions. Perhaps the most poignant legacy exists in the collective memory of northern Alabama communities. While the specific location of Blackwood Hollow has been deliberately obscured from public records to prevent exploitation, local oral histories preserve the case as a cautionary tale. My grandmother used to tell us about the Hollow people, recalled Robert Jenkins, an Alabama historian interviewed in 2010. It wasn't meant to frighten us, but to teach us about the importance of diversity and community connection, both social and genetic. Their isolation wasn't just physical. It was an isolation from knowledge that could have prevented tremendous suffering. The remaining adult Blackwoods who had been imprisoned eventually completed their sentences. Court records indicate that upon release, most relocated to distant states and changed their names, severing connections with their past. Elijah Blackwood died in prison in 1943, never acknowledging the harm they had caused or renouncing his beliefs. Martha Blackwood, who had cooperated with authorities and provided crucial testimony about the family's practices, lived until 1968. In her later years, she worked with researchers and occasionally spoke to medical students about her experiences, hoping that education might prevent similar tragedies. I believed we were keeping ourselves pure, she told a medical ethics class in 1962. I didn't understand we were destroying ourselves from within. Knowledge is protection. Remember that. Today, genetic counseling is standard practice for families with histories of inherited conditions. Advances in genetic testing can identify carriers of recessive traits, allowing informed reproductive decisions. These modern medical practices stand in stark contrast to the ignorance that trapped the Blackwood family in a cycle of intensifying genetic damage. The psychological impact of such extreme isolation, what researchers now call cultural sequestration, has become its own field of study, with the Blackwood case frequently cited as an early documented example. Modern protocols for integrating individuals from isolated cults or extremist communities draw on lessons learned from the Blackwood intervention. As we conclude this examination of one of America's most disturbing cases of generational consanguinity, we're left with profound questions about the balance between community autonomy and society's obligation to protect its most vulnerable members, particularly children born into circumstances they cannot choose or escape. If you watched all the way through this dark chapter of American history, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and understand who truly appreciates the in-depth historical investigations on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe for more hidden histories that mainstream media won't cover. Like this video to help our important educational content reach others who appreciate these historical investigations, and share it with someone who values learning about the overlooked shadows of our past. The Blackwood family's legacy serves as a powerful reminder that isolation, whether cultural, intellectual, or geographic, can create conditions where harmful practices perpetuate and intensify across generations. Their story, though difficult to confront, offers vital insights into the importance of education, community connection, and the careful preservation of both individual freedom and collective responsibility for preventing suffering.